So good evening and welcome to CMRS monthly seminar series. It is with great pleasure that I welcome Professor KarenJacobsen, a very old friend of CMRS and of myself. Professor Jacobsen has been collaborating with CMRS for over 10 years in different projects and research activities. It is not the first time for her to present at CMRS seminar series. I'm sure most of you are aware of her profile, but very quickly, Professor Jacobsen is a professor in global migration at the Fletcher School and the Friedman School of Nutrition, and directs the Refugee and Forced Migration Program at the Palestine International Center. Her publications include A View from Below, Conducting Research in Conflict Zones and the Economic Life of Refugees, which is widely used in courses on forced migration. She holds a PhD in political science from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, an MA in political science from Northeastern University, and earned her BA from University of Witwatersrand. Today she will present her new project, Refugees in Town. I will leave it for her to explain the project. As usual, she will talk for like 45 minutes and then we'll open the floor for Q&A.
Thank you very much, Maisa. It's a great pleasure to be here back at CMRS and AUC, and thank you all so much for coming. I want to keep the talk a little bit informal today, and I'm wondering if we can just start with a quick, just raise your hands if you're from the university, from AUC. Let's see, have a look at how many people are here, students or anybody from AUC. And from St. Andrews, other NGOs here in Cairo, and from UN or IOM, IOM, yes, thank you. Or from our embassy, our friends from other embassies. Great. It's always good to know who your audience is, right? Okay, so I want to keep this presentation less academic and more practical, practitioner-oriented. But since I am an academic, you're going to have some academic presentation to start. So, I want to tell you about this project of ours at Tufts that we have started in the past year. It's called the Refugees in Towns project. And this project, I'll just tell you how it started, began because, as you know, in 2016, we have a new president in America. And in 2017, this president changed the way that the US, that America, responds to refugees. It used to be that America had a fairly robust resettlement program. In fact, even though only less than 1% of the world's refugees are resettled, the US resettled the most. Now, unfortunately, the US's quota of people being resettled, of refugees being resettled, which used to be up around 100,000 or so under Obama, had gone up quite high. President Trump has shrunk that quota down to 20, 30,000, we don't know, probably less. And so today we're facing a situation in America where very few refugees are resettled. So I do most of my working life as a person researching refugees is focused on sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, decided that I wanted to look at what was happening in the US and how the US, civil society in the US, has responded to the Trump administration's shift in policy. And one thing that we are seeing in America, which is encouraging to many of us who are opposed to the Trump agenda, is that civil society, what we think of as, not the government, many organizations, people in civil society have pushed back against the Trump agenda. And when it comes to migration and refugees, we see this playing out at the level of towns and cities. So in some states in the US, towns and cities and the states themselves have resisted the Trump agenda. And we see things playing out, for example, that in some towns and cities have declared themselves to be sanctuary cities, or other towns have resisted the resettlement and crunch down. And so we're seeing a kind of an upsurging of civil society in the US, especially when it comes to migrants and refugees. So I became interested in looking at, particularly at what is happening with refugees in American cities and towns. How are refugees who are resettled there, and also asylum seekers who come to the US, how are those people settling in? How is the town responding to them? What is happening economically? What kind of impact are they having? How's the town receiving this impact culturally and economically? How's the town governance? How are the mayors and the municipalities responding? We see a lot of variation in the US. Some towns are resisting refugees. They are anti-migrant. The mayor is anti-migrant, anti-refugee. They are on board with Trump's agenda. Other towns, very much resisting it, not on board, sanctuary cities and so forth. So this was sort of a puzzle. Why is it that some towns do resist and others are on board? What is explaining this political response? That's interesting. But also, how are refugees doing in the US? We were curious about that. But then, as we got going and kind of looking at individual towns, I thought, well, I'm really interested in how refugees are doing in other countries as well. I've been interested in urban migration and urban displacement for many years. And, so I was wanting to expand this project outside of the US. So that's what we've done. My project manager, Charles Simpson, who's not here today, but he runs the project. He and I have set up this project, and we started soliciting case studies of towns and cities from people all over the world. So that's what I want to talk about today, and tell you what we've found so far, and where we're going with this project, and how we see it as being relevant, and what relevance it has for programming and practice. Okay. And by the way, we call it the Refugees in Towns project, but we're also interested not just in refugees, in migrants who come to towns, mixed migration, in all kinds of people who return, returnees. We're looking in Afghanistan at returnees. We're looking at different kinds of migrants, not just refugees. So let me just say a word about this term integration. So increasingly now we see a lot of resistance and problems with this word integration. Whether you talk to host governments, whether you talk to migrants and refugees themselves, or the host populations, people don't want to talk about integration. Governments don't want migrants and refugees to become integrated. They want them to move on with that. Migrants and refugees themselves have a very different understanding of this word integration and don't see themselves as being integrated and don't particularly want to become integrated in some cases. Well, there's a problem with the word. And host populations the same. They don't want migrants to be integrated. They want migrants to move on. So it's become a politically charged word. And it just holds a lot of sort of emotional and problematic implications. But so I just want to say that we recognize that, but we're using this word nonetheless in this project. Okay, so what are the goals of this project? They're academic goals and they're policy goals. In terms of academics, we are interested in the theory of integration. There's a lot of scholarship on integration, and a lot of that scholarship we've reviewed as part of this project. The problem with a lot of the work, for those of you who are academics, is the problem of what we call methodological nationalism. This is a term that was brought up years ago by Schiller and Argentini, who see methodological nationalism as a problem of looking at a single society, the whole national society, as representative of the whole experience. So, for example, if you were trying to understand how the U.S. responds to refugees, you would look at the whole of the U.S. You look at national data, national understanding of the whole of the U.S., and you would assume that that's telling you about the response to refugees. But of course, we know that this response is not a single national response in any place. When we are trying to understand response, we have to break this response down. It's like when people say there's no such thing as an American. There are many different kinds of Americans. And similarly, there are many different kinds of American responses to in this case, migration. So we really need to break down our understanding of the response to refugees by disaggregating that response, by looking at how different regions or different cities or different groups even respond. And that is an important piece of that's missing in the literature, because we tend to talk about how the EU has responded, or even how France has responded, or how Italy, or how South Africa, or how Australia has responded. But this is just what the government does sometimes. It's not really what the whole response is about. So in our approach, we are very much looking at using what's called grounded theory. I don't want to get into this too much because it's quite an academic term, but basically it means we're trying to understand a phenomenon, in this case integration, by looking at what's happening on the ground, and by developing our theory as we understand it from the data and from information that we're getting when we talk to communities and to people and individuals who are real people. We're not testing theory up, taking theory and testing it. We're developing our theory and understanding by focusing on communities and people and what's happening to them on the ground. And then the methods that we're using, this is where I think our project is quite innovative, not a word I like, but somewhat new in that we are very much focusing on what we call localized research. And I'll talk a bit about that in a second, because I really think this is a very important part of our project that's coming up with really interesting findings. So the academic piece is that, theory and methods. But we also have this policy, civics, or program objective and goal. We don't want to just do a bunch of studies and publish articles in erudite academic journals about it. Our goal is to actually bring about some kind of change. How can we use our research and evidence that we're gathering to promote real change and to bring about programs and practices and policies that can improve things for refugees? For us, this is very important. Not just me. The Feinstein International Center very much is oriented toward this kind of research. So we are really actively engaged in using the evidence that we generate through this project to work with organizations, whether they're UN organizations, UNHCR, IOM, whether they're NGOs who are working directly with people with refugees, and maybe even in some cases working with municipal governments, with mayor's offices, with town governments, and so forth. So, what I want to talk about now is our approach, our localized research approach. And so these are some of our researchers, and basically what this project is doing. This is how it works. In our first year, using our networks, we have well-established networks throughout the world, mostly in some countries, leaving out some countries, but we use our networks to identify people who are living or working in a particular city where there has been a significant refugee or migration flow. They could be refugees themselves, migrants. They could be people who are very familiar with the city and have worked there and lived there for a long time, worked with refugees. And it's these kind of people. They need not be academics or researchers themselves, that these kind of people we want to engage with and work with, help for us to use their local knowledge and understanding of that context and help us bring it to bear in our understanding of what's happening in the town. So this is what we mean by localized researchers. Those are the people who are giving us who are developing our case studies, imparting their local understanding and knowledge to us. And we, sitting in Boston, help them shape and sort of marshal, and maybe we do a little bit of training with them to help them deliver this case study to us. So the whole idea is to kind of really draw on people who have direct experience and understanding and knowledge of a town or city, and then to build the case study of that town around those people. So what we do not do is send researchers to a place and have them, do a bunch of interviews and focus groups and surveys and whatnot, and gather all the data and come back and analyze it back in Boston. No, that is not we do the opposite of that. We focus all the research on the places where people are and help them gather and marshal that evidence and feed it back to us this way. So in our first year, we have established, we have been putting together a bunch of, let me just show you, this is where all our case studies are in the first year. So we have, 3 studies in North America, in Maine, Texas, and Massachusetts. We have only 2 in Africa, in South Africa and Tanzania. 2 in South Asia, in Afghanistan and India. 3 in Europe, and 2 in the Middle East and North Africa. So these are particular cities that we're focusing on. And in some cases, they're smaller towns, but most of them are pretty large cities for the most part. Now, you may ask, how could you possibly have one person do a whole case study of a city like Athens or Istanbul or, Dar or Delhi? It's impossible. And indeed, how could a single researcher do a study of Delhi? So what we do when it comes to looking at very large cities like Cairo is we focus on the areas in the city, the neighborhoods in the city that are particularly affected by where refugees live. And it's those areas that we initially identify through a mapping, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then it's into those neighborhoods, refugee concentrations, where refugees are concentrated, those neighborhoods are the places in these cities that we focus on. Now I don't give away my whole thing. So this is where we are all over. And that's just in our first year, and now we're bringing on a second tranche of studies in our second year. So let me talk about our research methods. Like I said, we're doing qualitative data. We are not doing large end surveys, even though I myself am a survey researcher. No, we're not doing that anymore. We're not using external researchers. The focus of the research is usually chosen by the person themselves. They may be particularly interested in one aspect of what's going on in the town, or one group of refugees. There's many different groups often in the town, depending on their interest and knowledge. We support them with training. We provide graduate students from the Fletcher School who are interested in this project. They partner up with a local researcher and help them in writing and developing their research. We do a lot of remote support with them during the course of the study. And then what we're doing now is we've got all of our case studies, and we're jointly analyzing these data together. So we have large Skype meetings of all our researchers coming together and analyzing the data as we're doing our first round of analysis. One of the interesting pieces that's coming out of this project is we're developing some really good mapping methods, because one of the first objectives of our study is to map the city. So what we have is we have our local researcher, we train them to do this mapping. basically, they start by developing a list of the refugee neighborhoods, working with key informants and existing data sources. And then they cross-check or triangulate these neighborhoods working with different informants. So, for example, our Cairo researcher, who's Paul Miranda, who's with me here, he developed this map. This is just a partial map, very partial. In fact, how many would you say, how many neighborhoods did you come up with? Like 30?
30, 40.
30. Well, so now I'm just giving you a little piece of this table. This is Cairo's neighborhoods, with neighborhoods down the side and the different groups across the top. So Cairo has, at least this many refugee nationalities living in these different neighborhoods. So this mapping of Cairo is a useful map right in itself. And for each city, what we're trying to do is, and we do have developed the same kind of mapping by different refugee groups, according to the areas where they live. So that's the first thing that we do. So each case study starts with this mapping of refugees. We then we use this table to create the actual Google Maps of the city, which identify these neighborhoods and where they are. So that's the first objective. The second objective of each case is to look at the refugee experience and to look at the host community, the host population experience in these neighborhoods. So for example, in a neighborhood like Ardalua here in Cairo, we would look at what's happening to the refugees there and how